Onward to discussing the command pattern. So, what is it that the command pattern gives us? A command is basically a series of operations which is encapsulated together as one object. So, it basically converts a set of operations to something called an action object, where everything that is needed to be known in order to perform that logical cohesive action is contained within the same action object. This cohesive whole action object can then be passed around to different portions of your code. So you can pass it around from one logical unit to another, from one system to another as one object. And execute can be called on this action object at any point in time. So basically, this allows us to decouple what has to be performed, what is the action, from when it has to be performed, when execute should be called on it. So the decoupling of the what from the when is what the command pattern gives us. Now, before we take a look in some detail as to what the command pattern is, let's look at what programming paradigms are available to us today. Very basic and first principles programming involve variables, lists, dictionaries, and for loops. Very basic constructs, we've seen them all before. You can have functions which call other functions. In fact, you can have functions which call themselves. These are also pretty basic constructs. You can have classes which define interfaces, objects which are instances of these classes. Classes or objects have both state and behavior. So they have member variables as well as methods which define behavior. Now, what are these different programming paradigms as we've defined them? The simplest programming paradigm, which involves variables, lists, and dictionaries, is imperative programming. When your program revolves around functions as units, it's functional programming. And when your program revolves around objects as units, it's object-oriented programming. Now, old school languages like C followed the imperative programming paradigm. Java, C++, C#, these are object-oriented languages. And Excel, in fact, Excel is a programming language, just it has no for loops. Excel is a functional programming paradigm. So these are the basic programming paradigms that we have to work with in modern day programming languages. Now, it seems very easy to talk about these programming paradigms in this well-defined manner. The actual fact is that the lines between these programming paradigms can sometimes get a bit blurry. They don't always live within their boundaries. Programs have no boundaries between the different types. So consider a class that has just one method, exactly one. If you've used Java enough, you know that this is really common when you implement an interface, especially for listeners. Now, this one method of this class encapsulates all the state that is needed for the one method to execute. That one method knows everything needed, it's passed in some way, for example, to execute completely. Is such a class really a class? Or is it just a function? One method classes, are they classes or functions? These classes, which cross the boundary between object-oriented and functional programming, are the basis of the command pattern. Now that we've mentioned it, I'm sure it's a logical question to ask, and I think it's logical, is what good is a class with just one method? What can it actually do? How powerful is it? In fact, there are a whole number of things that it could do. It can be incredibly powerful. Use of it in menus, threading, undo managers, which allow you to undo the last action. All of these are built on top of these one method classes. And this is just a small subset of what all can be done. Listeners to actions, listeners to UI controls. All of these are one method classes. Command objects lie at the heart of the command pattern. So what is this command object? Let's try and define this and see what it gives us. A command object has a single method and whatever state is needed for that method to execute. The method to do its thing has all the information that it needs within that single object, which is the command object. So a single object with all the state for one method to execute. You can also think of the command object as a method that can be passed around as an object. The command object forms a logical unit which can be executed kind of standalone. So you can pass it around in different portions of your code till it executes. It is this command object which separates an action, which is what has to be done. So that one method in the command object has a whole series of operations which define that action. So a command object separates an action from the execution of that action, which means when that object's execute command is called is completely independent of what the action is. So you decouple these two. It's for this reason that command objects are also called action objects. It holds an action and separates the action from the execution of that action. Let's take an example to understand how a command object would work in the real world. Now the core of this is a command object separates the execution of an action from the action itself. This idea is the most important thing that you need to remember. What the action is specified in the command object. When the action is called is decoupled from it. So let's consider a very simple user interface which kind of looks like what you're drawing on screen. All this user interface has is a display which will show you something and a button which you can click. So the button says click here and we have a display which shows a message. This button acts on that display. So when the user clicks that button, hi there will show up on the display. This is the message to the user when the user clicks on the button. Now, the important thing to remember here is that we know what we want the button to do. It's very clear. We want the button to update the display with the hi there message. But we have no idea when the user will actually click the button. We have no idea when the code which lies behind the button click will be executed, but we do know the action that we want the button to take. A command object is just what we need at this point. We don't know when execute will be called on the button, but we know what the button should do. So this was a simple example using layman's terms. However, every part of this little example has an official name in the command pattern. Let's see what those official names are so you know exactly how things fit in. So we have the client, the invoker, and the receiver. They're all very easy. They're exactly what we just saw. The receiver is the display which is acted upon by the action. So the receiver receives the action. It's what is acted upon. The invoker is the button which is clicked by the user or the client to trigger the execution of the action. The invoker invokes the action, which is why it's called the invoker. Triggers the execution of the action. And lastly, we have the client. The client is the user who's figuring out when that action should be invoked. The user who triggers the execution of the action is the client. In this case, it's us as the user of that user interface. However, it could easily be another system. So we understand the client, invoker, and the receiver. Now, the trigger, the actual trigger which causes the action to be executed, also has a name, and that is called an event. So this is the trigger. Now, UI elements publish a whole range of events, and our code can subscribe to those events. For example, that button can specify when it's clicked, double-clicked, right-clicked, and so on. So UI elements like a button publish a wide range of events, and our code can subscribe to those events. This subscription to a publisher is the observer design pattern. It's interesting how all these design patterns come together in order to build up your code and set standard designs for programming. This interplay of the observer and the command pattern is the bedrock of UI programming. User interface programming is not just one design pattern. There's a whole bunch of things happening together. And this observer and the command pattern coming together helps build frameworks for UI programming.